Minister, a lot of us have read the recent report of the National Competitiveness Council, which is called The Cost of Doing Business in Ireland. And Professor Peter Clinch, I think, of the Council, he spoke recently to our Budget Oversight Committee, but it makes fairly dismal reading. So I just wanted to ask you, I mean, in relation to the European Directive, ECN Plus Directive, to empower competition authorities of Member States to be more effective enforcers of the internal market, I know Chairperson Isolde Goggin recently has asked that additional powers would go to the CCPC. Are we in the process of doing that now? Are we going to bring those forward, or have we already brought some of them into effect? Thanks, Count.
2 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, Last Count Corla, and thank Deputy Broughan for raising this issue. I think it's a very important issue, and of course one of the principal statutory functions of the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission is to investigate breaches of EU and Irish competition law. That is Article 101 and Article 102 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and Section 4 and Section 5 of the Competition Act 2002. At the conclusion of the investigation into a suspended breach of Irish or EU competition law, the CCPC may form the view that any infringement of either Section 4 or 5 of the Competition Act 2002 and, if relevant, Article 101 and Article 2 has occurred. The EU Directive 2019-1 of the European Parliament and of the Council of 11th of December 2018 to empower the competition authorities of the Member States is to be more effective enforced and to ensure that the proper function of the internal market was published in the EU Official Journal on the 14th of January 2019. The directive, known as ECN Plus Directive, that's the European Competition Network Directive, must be transposed by the 4th of February 2021 and will give the CCPC additional enforcement powers. Will herald the introduction of non-criminal fines for breaches of EU competition law. I'm also aware that the Reform Commission made recommendations for additional powers for regulatory bodies in its report, the Regulatory Powers and Corporate Offences, in November 2018, and we are considering the recommendations of this report, including those related to additional financial sanctions in the context of the transposition of the ECN Plus Directive. I believe that will be necessary to transpose the directive by primary legislation, given the necessary for the introduction of a new system of financial sanctions for non-criminal breaches of EU law. Further additional powers are under consideration. I think that's to be emphasised alongside the transposition of the directive. The transposition of the directive will result in the strengthening of the tools at the disposal of the CCPC for the future competition enforcement in Ireland. Deputy Broughan.
Thanks, Minister. Well, that report I referred to, the cost of doing business in Ireland, it does make some, findings which I think you need to address early on. You say the legislation can be down to 2021, but surely there's an urgency about it. For example, the report says this is the 5th most expensive economy of the 28. Our prices are, generally speaking, 13% above EU average. When you start going into the various sectors, then we've some of the highest childcare costs in Europe. We have areas like the lack of competition, and we've seen it recently in beef processing, and the fact that the CCPC has been asked to investigate that. Then across the whole insurance sector, I mean, we've had umpteen discussions in this House. The chairperson of the Finance Committee brought forward a report on it in terms of construction costs. For example, for commercial building, I think only London is more expensive than Dublin. Across a whole plethora of activities, we see we're a very costly economy, and at the end of the day, the ordinary citizens have to bear that.
Of course, we're all very much in agreement that the CCPC needs more powers. I mean, up to now, in several cases, all the CCPC could do is fine bodies particularly for dominant companies in a dominant position. And of course, all they could do really, the only powers they had was to get an injunction in the courts to stop the behaviour. But of course, they had no powers to impose fines, and I think that's something that we're very conscious of. They need to be able to impose fines. They had no clawbacks as well. So, I mean, you know yourself, in preparation for, and I've worked with you before, in preparation for legislation, this legislation can be complex. We have until February 21. I can guarantee you today that the legislation will be in place before the 4th of February 2021. And there will be an opportunity for people to look at all all options here in relation to this. I think that's important to point out in relation to it. Primary legislation is the best way forward. We saw how it worked well for GDPR, and that was something that was coming from Europe as well. So, I mean, it is the best way of looking at it, and I think we have to have robust legislation in this area. I think that's important, and we need to prepare well for this legislation. That's why it's going to take considerable time, but the Oireachtas will have an opportunity to come and to work on that.
Question.
Various deputies today, including myself, about being Brexit ready. And given the context of maybe the post-Brexit economy, isn't it critical then that we do control costs? I mean, you'd agree that costs do matter. And your colleague, I know the Minister for Justice and others, were looking at the role the courts may play in, for example, insurance costs and in other costs. But I mean, across a whole plethora, for example, business expenses. Again, I've heard it on many sides of the House in relation to interest rates. I mean, why we can't benefit from our membership of the European community in the financial sector, why businesses have to, and indeed families have to pay so much higher rates. But it's particularly, I think, in areas like insurance and in energy costs, in all the inputs into business and indeed into households, that people feel that we should maybe go about taking this legislation for the CCPC and implement it as urgently as possible, Minister.
Thank you, Les Corla, and thank Deputy Broughan again for raising this issue. Of course, it's of primary importance of the government doing business here is to keep costs down. It's really important for us as a country to be competitive now, particularly in the context of Brexit out there. And that's why I suppose we brought in a number of initiatives, and particularly in relation to Brexit. Low-cost loans is one area we brought in. But I mean, it is important. You rightly pointed out in relation to insurance. This is an issue that has been raised, I suppose, continuously in the House, and a lot of work has been done in this by the government. And of course, today you see the European Commission carry out a further investigation again in the future, something I won't be commenting, or the government can't comment on at the moment, because the European Commission is independent. But all this is extremely important for Ireland to be sure that all our businesses are competitive out there, that we bring costs down as much as possible. And that's why we're given the CCPC these extra powers to be on par with our European countries. To be on par with our European countries. So I think a lot of work will be done on this, and that you'll have an input into that, Deputy.
Listen.